What's up guys, I'm Rich from Spray Black Studios, and today I'm going to continue my Successor Chapter painting series by painting up a Black Templar in the Grimdark style. So with the popularity of my first ever video of painting Blanchitsu for beginners, I've been asked by a number of viewers about further videos of how to paint in the Grimdark style. Now I had a bit of a think about trying to fit this in with my Space Marine Successor Chapter painting series, and when thinking about it, one chapter really stood out. The Black Templars. For those who don't know who the Black Templars are, they're a successor chapter of the Imperial Fists, and they are what is known as a crusading chapter, with various similarities in their iconography and their styling to the Knights of the Crusades in the Middle Ages. These guys are probably the closest that we get for Space Marine religious zealots. As strict devotees of the Imperial cult, the Black Templars believe in the Emperor as the God Emperor and have devoted themselves to continuing the Great Crusade, something that they have done since the very first times of the first founding. Now, although most of the imagery of the Black Templars is particularly knightly, they are far from being knights in shining armour. Most of the artwork tends to depict their grittier side, and for that is where the Grimdark painting style really comes into its own. For those who aren't aware of the Grimdark painting style, it's a painting style that's become popular fairly recently and is aimed at really giving more of a realistic feel to your minis than you generally get doing the heavy metal style that Games Workshop puts on pretty much all of its box art. Generally the style uses a lot of washes, weathering and desaturated colours just to give a more lifelike feel to it. Now a lot of people often get confused over the differences between the Grimdark style and Blanchitsu style of paintings, but the short answer is really there isn't much. This is fairly divisive, and I know that some of the more elitist Blanchitsu painters do get a bit upset about the dumbing down of the style to be referred to as Grimdark, as generally the Grimdark is slightly less stylised and generally a little bit easier than painting the Blanchitsu, but the essential kind of techniques are still the same, and actually the end product and the aim is pretty similar. For me, really, it's the difference between punk and pop punk. Influences may be different, but the core is still the same. So then, let's take a closer look. Now for our subject today, with an Assault Intercessor Sergeant from the Indomitus box set that's had a couple of little touches added. A head swap with a more knightly helmet and some jeweler's chain added around his torso and his wrist give the mini a little bit more of a Black Templar feel. To prepare this mini, I primed him using Vallejo Surface Primer. Now whilst the armour is already black, I'm not just going to leave it as it is, so I'm going to use the technique for quickly and easily getting those highlights and those shadows into place, starting off with a fairly heavy dry brush of Eshin Grey, and then followed up with a lighter dry brushing of Dawnstone. For both of these steps we need to try and ensure that we're applying the paint zenithally, so that we can force the perspective to show that the light is coming from above the model. These dry brush layers will also pick out all of those raised areas and start to build up the contrast. With a very light dry brushing of Celestra Grey as a final highlight added, the armour is now very much reading as grey rather than black, and it's not a Grey Templar, so we're going to have to darken it all back down again. To do this, I'm going to use a series of washes to tint and darken all those armour panels. Initially starting with a wash of Drakenhof Nightshade, this will give the grey a very slight blue tint to it and put some colder tones into those shadows. Once this is dried, I'm then going to use the Agrax Earthshade into the recesses and the real shadowed areas. This will start to put a few more warmer earthy tones into those blacks as well. Now I've got to be honest, I actually really quite like the look of the armour at this point, but it's not what we're going for, and definitely still reading more as a blue-grey colour than black, so we're going to turn to some Nuln Oil layers to darken it all back down again. This is going to take a few coats to really get it to where I want it, so I'm going to take this chance to thank the Instagram page Questionable Loyalties, who is the gentleman that taught me this technique many years ago. Now it's looking much better. With the armour done, it's time to get some of those metallics done. With Lead Belcher, I'll go in and paint up all those metallic areas, such as the chains, the ribbon between the armour plates, and on the weapons. Due to the fact that the weathering stage will end up putting some different tones into the metals, we don't really need to do anything fancy here, apart from pop a little bit of Nuln Oil into it. Now normally the Black Templars tend to have a fairly bright, clean white for their shoulder pads, but to really make them work with the Grimdark feel, I'm going to use a nice off-white just to throw a few brown tones into it. To start this off, I'll use a layer of Dryad bark over the shoulder pads and on that tilt plate on his chest. To build this up to that off-white colour that I'm going for, I'm going to then mix in some Rakarth flesh into that Dryad bark and lay this over that base coat. This gives quite a nice greyish brown colour, which isn't too far from what we want, but I am going to have to push it just a little bit brighter to make it read more white. One of the key parts of the Grimdark style is actually using various textures within your painting, and here is an area that we can add a little bit in. By using a dry brush in an almost stippling-like manner on those shoulder pads, with some pure Rakarth flesh I can brighten the shoulder pads further, but also add in a little bit of that texture just to break up that flat surface. I'm not going to finish there though. With some Pallid Witch flesh applied in the same way, I can push the brightness just a little bit further, so now we've got it reading as a proper off-white colour. As a final little finishing touch, a wash of Agrax Earthshade will pop a little bit more colour into the recesses of the purity seals and to the edges of those shoulder pads. This will give all of those areas an almost parchment-like look to them. Absolutely perfect for the zealous Black Templars. Now I'm not going to stick with such a monotone colour scheme though. A couple of little spot colours added in will nicely accent this colour scheme, and the first of those is going to be a little bit of Gal Vorbak added to the centre stripe of that tilt plate and the wax stamps of the purity seals and on his eye lenses. And then to push this just a little bit brighter, I'm going to turn to Corn Red as the highlight. For the leather areas like the holster for his pistol, I'll turn to a trusty formula, starting off with Rhinox Hide as a base coat, and then edge highlighted with a mix of Rhinox Hide and Steel Legion Drab. After adding in a few little scratches as well, I'll then turn to pure Steel Legion Drab just to pick out the corners where I want those very extreme highlights. Now whilst those shoulder pads look quite pretty, they also look a bit barren. Since I don't have any Black Templars decals, it means that I'm going to have to freehand the Maltese Cross that these Black Templars are so well known for. To do this, I'll use some Corvus Black and initially mark out a small cross shape that I'll use as a reference, and then from there I'll add in some diagonal lines to form each arm of the cross, and then finish them off with a V-shaped dovetail at the end. I will say that if this wasn't a bit of a speed paint, then I could definitely do this a bit more accurately, but I would say for what we want now, it looks pretty good. Whilst the Corvus Black is out, I'll also add in some writing on all those purity seals as well. So that's the bulk of the model done. It's now time to start on the weathering. With a mix of Dawnstone and Xandri dust, I'm going to dry brush a little bit of dusty dirt around his boots and the lower part of his legs. So I'd have to say, I'm pretty happy using this guy on the tabletop just as he is. He would certainly look good enough upon my shelf, but we've not really hit that Grimdark level yet. We need to add some proper weathering. And now is the time that I look like I'm going to utterly ruin all of the good work that I've done so far. To start off the weathering, I'm going to use a Grimdarker's favourite, AK Interactive's Streaking Grime. Streaking Grime is an enamel based paint, very different to the acrylic based paints that we're used to using. It's oil based, which means that we need to take a slightly different tact with it. Adding some white spirit into the Streaking Grime thins it down enough for me to be able to apply a layer over the whole model using my airbrush. Now as you can see, the model looks like I've dunked it into a muddy puddle, and you may be thinking that I've just ruined that lovely paint job. But with a cotton bud and a bit of white spirit, I can remove that Streaking Grime from the upper areas and from the raised details to bring back some of that paint job and leave the grime in the recesses. much better. Now I do want to add another little splash of colour, and it's not right to have the plasma pistol without a little bit of object source lighting. With a mix of Vallejo Hex Lichen and Warlord Purple, I'll very carefully apply this around the plasma coil with my airbrush. Then go into pure Warlord Purple, I'm going to apply this directly onto the coil, just letting it spill over ever so slightly, just to give the impression that it's glowing. And to really give the impression that this pistol is being overcharged, I'm going to add some squid pink into the lower areas of the coil to start to really give it a glow. And then with a mix of squid pink and white, I'm going to pick out the very centre of the coil. Now it really does look like it's glowing and about to go off. Once that's done and dried, I'd say that the paint job is done. I need him on a base for the final little bits though. So I'm going to add a little bit of super glue and drop him onto a base that I made earlier. Now I want to tie him in nicely to that base so it looks nice and natural. And for that, I'm going to use some Vallejo weathering pigment. Using a large old brush, I'll apply this to his boots, to his lower legs and to the ground around his feet. To seal this in and stop it from falling off, I'm now going to apply some matte varnish through my airbrush, making sure to really turn the pressure down so as not to blow it all away. As a final little touch, we can't have a Grimdark Black Templar with a chainsword without adding a bit of blood onto that weapon. A mix of Blood for the Blood God and Typhus Corrosion will give me more of a dried, congealed looking blood, which of course I will apply liberally. And with that, we have one completed Grimdark Black Templar.
So this was a really fun little project to do. Whilst not so technically advanced, the Grimdark style of painting really is quite rewarding and actually gives a fairly awesome end product. And for an army like the Black Templars, the Grimdark style of painting is actually pretty thematic. For some of these steps I've used an airbrush, but it's far from an essential tool when painting in this style. For things like the OSL, simple dry brushing would do the trick. For applying the streak and grime, a normal brush would do it. I've just tended to use the airbrush for these as A, it gives a little bit more control, and B, it just makes it quicker. Now if you want to learn more about painting in the Grimdark style, I do have another video, and there is plenty of other resources online, but if there's anything particular in the style that you want to learn, then please feel free to drop something down below in the comments just to ask and I'll see what I can do. So this Black Templar has joined my Successor Chapter shelf, and now I'm looking for my next chapter to do. Ideally, I'd like to see maybe a few slightly more obscure chapters involved, and preferably not another Imperial Fist successor. If you have got any ideas, then please, again, just let me know. So thank you for watching this video, guys. If you got some value out of it, then please hit that like button and hit that big red subscribe button if you don't want to miss the future mini painting goodness that I've got coming. And remember guys, if all else fails, spray it black and start again.